We are in a deep study in the book of Luke and have been for over a year. If you have your Bible, go ahead and take that out. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles in the chairs in front of you. I'm deeply grateful to Jeremy Mann, and I know the answer to this question already, but I'm sure you enjoyed the heck out of it for 3 weeks. Is he just a great guy? He was so stressed about giving those talks, it was ridiculous. So I just gave him 2 more. And so he's a very, very gifted guy, and just so cool to see his passion come out. Anyway, he's now in Hawaii relaxing. We're in Luke chapter 16, and we'll start in verse 9. Luke 16 and verse 9. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. Excuse me. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, it says, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, excuse me, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John the Baptist. Since that time, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. How's that for a nice, easy passage this morning to attack? I'm excited about it. We are in a pretty good-sized section in Luke, and it includes all of 16 or 15 and all of 16. I've never seen this before because I've just never studied Luke to this depth, and it's really beautiful. I've never seen how these passages all go together. Luke intends us to, and I believe probably Jesus spoke these all at the same time, for chapter 15 and the parables in chapter 15 to go with chapter 16. It's one single discussion, one single audience, one single argument that is taking place. There are these parables where Jesus starts with a parable of the lost sheep that Jeremy taught on. You recall that? There's 100 sheep, one gets lost. He leaves the 99, not by themselves, but there are other shepherds, so they're still tended to, and he goes after and finds the one of his 200-pound sheep, puts it on his shoulders, carries it back, the whole community celebrates. Then there's the second parable where the woman has 10 coins. She loses a coin. She turns the whole house upside down to find this lost coin. And they're celebrating over this lost coin. Then Jesus rolls right inside the same parable to the lost sons. Jeremy very poignantly said it's not really, should not be called the prodigal son. It should be called the lost sons and the father who found them. It's about 2 sons that are lost. The one that stays home is lost. The one that leaves is lost. And what an amazing father this is. And what takes place in this setting is, there are really 3 audiences. The first audience, I'll just pick you guys, because you'll know why. There's the tax collectors and the sinners, and I really didn't think that until you moved into the front row, Paul. And that screamed tax collector and sinner to me. So there's one group in the audience that are the tax collectors and sinners. There's a second group in that audience, they're the Pharisees. And there's a third group in the audience, and they're the disciples. And really they have, yeah. So you guys really, you all can just leave, because this really isn't for you. Your life is together, go have some coffee. Let's get these folks straightened out. I've always felt that way, which is why I would sit on this side. The text doesn't say it, but probably the primary audience, at first as Jesus tells these stories, are these guys. The tax collectors and sinners. They're outcasts. They're not towing the line properly. They can't get their life together. They're inconsistent. They're creeksiders. And so Jesus is telling these parables to let them know, look, you are the lost coin. You are the lost sheep. You are the lost sons. And oh, by the way, the Father will go to the nth degree to find you and bring you home. You're the ones that are welcome in the kingdom. And while Jesus is telling those stories, the Pharisees are agitated. They're not blowing up, but they're agitated. And they're really a secondary audience for Jesus, who's able to do two things shockingly at the same time. And as Jesus tells the inclusiveness of the kingdom to the tax collectors and the sinners, these Pharisees are agitated because they don't think any of these people are worthy of the kingdom. They don't live well, they don't think well, they're not consistent, they're not worthy of God. And really, the bottom line is they don't compare well with them. And so Jesus is indirectly targeting them, saying, this is who the Father is including, and oh, by the way, you're not, and you should be. And they're agitated, but they're not irate yet. It isn't until chapter 16 when Jesus flows right into another parable, and it's a parable that we did out of order because I was headed to Austria. It's the parable of the master and the unjust steward. You remember this from about 4 weeks ago? It's the master has a large estate, and he's got this manager, and the manager's been cheating him. And the master calls him to his desk and says, you need to give an accounting. Really what he asks him to do is, basically you're fired on the spot, go get the accounting books and turn them in. The guy leaving decides, I've only got a little bit of time, I've got to do something with these accounting books. So he calls the renters to him one at a time, and they cook the books together and work out a deal to be even more corrupt and rip the master off even more. And Jesus gets to the end of the parable, and unlike the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost sons, Jesus does not highlight the master in the parable. He highlights who? The dishonest steward. Because you read this thing, it's just a horrible parable, isn't it? It's maybe one of the best Jesus has ever told. And what he says is, you should be more like this guy. Not in how corrupt he was, but in an understanding he had. This guy knew something about money. He knew money was really a means to an end. This guy used money to invest in people so that when he got kicked out of the master's house, he had another friend's house to go to. Now, at this point, this is where we are in this morning's discussion. And Jesus will stop speaking in parables, and now he will speak directly to the Pharisees. And what happens this morning is these guys fade in the background. The sinners and tax collectors now have what they want. They have the acceptance of God. They see themselves as the lost coin that was found. They see themselves as the prodigal son, returned and accepted by the Father, even with a shabby repentance. They see themselves as the sheep who was sought after and brought back. What more do they need? They've got the acceptance of God. They fade, the Pharisees step forward, and by verse 14, we have an absolute fight on our hands between Jesus and these Pharisees. Jesus is now going to target these Pharisees very directly by saying, basically, you are living wrong. You're cheating the whole system. By the middle of chapter 16, they're mocking him. So let's start working our way through this section and understand what it is Jesus says that irritates them so much. And let's try to understand what their thinking was, and unfortunately, how much we're like them. Verse 9. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness. One quick comment. This section is going to feel a lot like it's about money and possessions. Mammon was a term that was used for material stuff. It includes money, but it includes your land, your house, your car, your bike. It includes your couch. It includes anything you own. Your tennis shoes, all your clothes in your closet, everything. So mammon is anything material that you own. Does that make sense? And when we read this, it's going to feel like it's about money, but it's not. Money is simply the thermometer in the room to tell us what's wrong. There's actually something deeper going on than their issue with material stuff. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves. Jesus says this right at the end of this parable of the unjust steward. Make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings. What is he saying? We looked at this 4 weeks ago. What he's saying is this. This is what your material stuff is for. You should use your material stuff to buy people into heaven. How's that for a rude comment? You should use whatever means you have to love people so that one day, on the chance that it helps them introduce them to Christ and find forgiveness and a saving grace, when you walk in the next life in heaven, you will be greeted all day long by people with a smile on their face that look at you and say, "Thank you so much for investing in me. You're part of the reason I'm here." Isn't that a great thought? This is what, by the way, your stuff is for. Now, that seems odd coming from a guy who just got back from Austria, gorging himself like foie gras. But this is what it's for. To actually enjoy it and then invest in the people around us. And that's what Jesus is saying now to the Pharisees. You've got it all wrong. You think people are a means to an end. It's exactly the opposite. It's your material stuff that is a means to an end. Use it so that one day you're greeted by those very people when you get into heaven. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. Let me ask you this question. What is in this verse the little thing? This is really difficult. The stuff. Think about what you just said. In God's equation, pretty much in Jesus' thought, the smallest thing he can come up with is your material stuff. And you and I are thinking, you're insane, you haven't lived here long enough. This is Jimmy Stewart speaking to the angel. What's the angel's name in It's a Wonderful Life? Clarence. And Clarence is telling him how money doesn't matter. And Jimmy Stewart looks up there and he says, "Comes in pretty handy down here, bub." If you think about your week, how much time you had to spend in pursuit of just being able to obtain material stuff to live, this seems like a ridiculous comment. And we don't need to deny it. I went to work all week long. I know it's a shock to some of you, but I actually was at work this week trying to make money so that I could eat and pay bills and do all the things that I like to do, right? And then Jesus looks at it and he says, "Oh, by the way, there's nothing smaller in your life than your material stuff. He who is faithful in a little thing like your material stuff, is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing," meaning the way you handle your material stuff, "is unrighteous also in much." And listen to this. This is a kicker verse. "Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth." Translation. If you can't be faithful in the smallest thing I can think of, which is your material stuff, who will entrust? Now, my Bible says the true riches to you. But the word riches is in italics because in the Greek it's not there. The literal translation of this is, then who will entrust the truth to you? Here's the translation that God is saying to us. This is what Jesus is saying. If I can't trust you to manage your material stuff well, how on earth can I ever reveal to you the mysteries of life? You know, if you really sit and think about it, this is the weight of gold. How do I raise my kids? How do I know how to love my spouse properly? How do I navigate this lost world with wisdom? How do I know the mysteries of how to navigate what my calling and gifting is? How do I know how to get along with people when I'm hard to get along with and so are they? How do I know how to get up in the morning and forgive somebody when I can't seem to do it? These are the weighty things of life. These are the mysteries of God. And Jesus looks at you and I and says, if you can't manage something as stupid as your material stuff, then how on earth will God turn around and hand you the gold of His mysteries and wisdom? Amen. Verse 12. And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's. Do you remember the story of the guy that comes to Jesus and says in chapter 12, make my brother split the inheritance with me? Jesus says, I'm not your judge. And he tells the story of the idiot who built his barns and ended up dying. And Jesus says, you fool, today your soul is required of you. The message there was, you're trying to draw life from your material stuff. You only draw life from God. And you don't own anything anyway. Even your soul you don't own. That's what's wrapped up in this statement. If you have not been faithful in the use of that which is not even yours, meaning all your material stuff is God's anyway, you're actually the manager in this whole deal, who will give you that which is your own? Your own in this case, again, is wisdom and the keys to the mysteries of life. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. This entire passage now turns on verse 14. He has told the story about the lost sheep, the lost coins, the lost sons, so that the tax collectors and the sinners know they're welcome. He has told the story of the unbelievably forgiving master and his poor manager, who, by the way, at least understands this principle that wealth is a means to an end. And on that note, he frustrates the Pharisees, and he speaks directly to them to let them know, you're off, you're cheating the system. And now they get irate. Now they attack him. They do not mock him in chapter 15. Now they're ticked. Look at verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, it says. This word for lovers is not agape. It's not that deepest love. It's philos. It's literally, your buddy is silver. That's the literal translation. Your best buddy you like to hang out with is actually your material stuff. Now the Pharisees, who were buddies with silver, were listening to all of these things, meaning all the way back to chapter 15, and were scoffing at him. This word scoff means it's a really subtle deal in the Middle East. It's no words are spoken. It's the head is just tilted slightly back into the side, and the eyebrows are like, you're an idiot. So now the Pharisees are posturing before Jesus. And it's critical we see these two scene changes. It's critical that we see that the audience has now shifted from the tax collectors and sinners to now it's just a conversation between Jesus and the Pharisees. The disciples and the tax collectors and sinners have faded into the background. It's simply now an argument. So the audience has switched, and now it's an argument between Jesus and these guys. And now they scoff. These very people that Jesus has been indirectly targeting in these conversations. And we've been talking about this for a while. What is the real issue with the Pharisees? You know, when you go to church for too long, you hear the same thing. We all say the same thing about the Pharisees. That the Pharisees' number one problem is that they are legalists. Isn't this the term we always use? And what we mean by legalists are they're just into rules. They're overly into rules. This is the problem with the Pharisees. They're too rule-oriented. And what I've discovered, particularly in the book of Luke, and I've been trying to say over and over because Jesus has been saying it over and over, we're going to do it again this morning, is this is not their main issue. This simply points to a deeper issue with them. The problem with the Pharisees is not that they're legalists. The fundamental issue with the Pharisees is they are dishonest about their insides. That's the problem with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are unwilling to admit how broken and weak they are. This is why this group, the tax collectors and the sinners, are so much more put together than the Pharisees over here. Because these guys at least know they're a mess. This is my brother's wise comment to me in the middle of his divorce, and I've shared this many times up front. He said, we're all a mess. The problem is only a few of us know it. This is the difference between humanity. We're all broken, but the problem is when you fight it, you're basically fighting reality. And that's what the problem with the Pharisees is. Jesus says to them, you remember this statement? Here's the deal. I'm a doctor. I'm here for sick people. So if you're not sick, then I'm not here for you. Now his statement isn't, Pharisees, you're not sick. The problem is you don't know you're sick. And you're fighting that you're sick. So if you want to fight that you're sick, you're never going to go to the hospital. You're never going to get a doctor. You're never going to get help. This is Jesus' comment. Don't fight reality. So the real issue is that they are inwardly dishonest with their own heart. Right? And as a result of that, they create a false sense of self. And the false sense of self says, I'm fine. The false sense of self says, let me look at what I do well, and I'll focus on that so that I don't have to look at what I don't do well. They're not straight with themselves, and the only choice then that they have is to turn outward and moralistic. See, what we see as moralism, what we see as legalism, what we see as rule-oriented is actually the result of something else. They fight their own reality, they're not honest with what sinners they are, and how much they need God in their life, and how broken they are, and as a result they only have one choice. They have to pick everybody else apart. See, either I'm wrong or you are, but it won't be both. Does that make sense? I know you've seen this in your life. Please, you've seen this in your life. When I have a sense of how broken I am, how inconsistent I am, how horribly I can treat people or think about people, suddenly I'm a little more compassionate with the people around me. Does that make sense? And when I lose touch with my own reality, how weak I am, what I'm really like when I'm not in the sense of the presence of God, when I'm really not connected with that, I'm pretty horrible. I look around and I go, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you, I'm better than you. It's really one or the other. And that's the problem that Jesus is fighting. These guys are fighting their own reality. Verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were buddies with silver, were listening to all this, and they were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves. Do you see that? Meaning, you're not just getting in touch with your brokenness, you're justifying yourself, so you have to be honest with yourself. You justify yourself in the sight of men, which is also part of this equation. When we compare ourselves to God, we don't come out very well. When we get into the equation of comparing ourselves with everybody around us, then we justify ourselves. You know what this is like? This is like the passage I'm going to be preaching in December. The two guys go up to the Temple Mount during the time of the prayer, and the one Pharisee stands aloof, Gail's shaking his head from everybody else because he doesn't want to be defiled. And he says, thank you, God, I'm not like the rest of these sinners. Isn't that great? Not for a moment does he look up and say, wow, you and I, we don't equal each other. Does that make sense? But now I'm looking at you and I say, you know what? You equal me. It's the wrong equation. It's the problem that the Pharisees have. You justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. It's interesting. The Pharisees think, when they hear these parables, what a stupid father. He just got ripped off a third of his wealth. He's an idiot. And on top of that, when the prodigal comes back, he's not even really repenting, which I think Jeremy did a beautiful job on. He's a fool. And then they hear the next parable, and they say, that master is even dumber than the father was. His managers are ripping him off. His renters are ripping him off. They're all stupid. Because they're comparing themselves to these other people. But to Jesus says, the material stuff is simply a tool for relationship, not the other way around. It's the small thing, the wealth, the small thing that we use to invest in the big thing, humanity. The question Jesus has is, how can this stuff then be used to invest in the people around you? Verse 16. The law and the prophets, Jesus says, were proclaimed until John the Baptist. Since that time, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. What is Jesus saying? Up until John the Baptist, God's story in the Old Testament was rolling along. And there's a demarcation point at John the Baptist because I showed up. And now I'm here, and now I'm telling you the kingdom starts right now. I'm the king, you're the subjects, and we're going to do it the way I want to do it. And here's, by the way, Jesus says how I want to do it. The first will be last, and the last will be first. That's how my kingdom is. My kingdom is placing other people before your need. That's how my kingdom is. My kingdom is people are more important to me than the rules of the Torah itself. So if I want to break the Sabbath, guess what? I'm going to break the Sabbath because people are more important to me than even the Sabbath. And oh, by the way, the Torah, those are my rules anyway. I can break it anytime I want. That's what Jesus says. It rolled all the way along until John, but now I'm here. I established the rules of the kingdom. And here's the way the kingdom works. People are more important than your possessions. And oh, by the way, use your possessions to invest in people. It's fascinating. But he says, you won't join the kingdom on my terms. Even though I'm the king. You won't humble yourself. You won't stop for a moment and be honest about how corrupt you are and how judgmental you are that you think you're better than all these other people because you're keeping a bunch of little rules that you've made up. And you're forcing your way into the kingdom like everybody else. I'm not interested in that, he says. You mask the true intent of God's law. You avoid doing the weightier things by adding all these stupid little things. And then you do your small stuff to feel good about yourself and miss the entire point of why I made the rules up in the first place. You see me, Jesus says, walk on the Sabbath into a synagogue and see a stooped-over woman and heal her, and you're all upset. But you'll go out to your house as soon as the service is done and untie your donkey and never think twice about it. That's disgusting. You see the father of the prodigal and you say how stupid he is to be duped by this guy and to bring him in. And what you miss is how kind he is and how much he desires a relationship, that he doesn't care about being ripped off. It's irrelevant to him. You see the master of the story and you say, what a fool. His renters steal from him, his manager steals from him, and you miss the whole point. He cares nothing of debt. Money means nothing to the master because it's a means to an end. You're complete fools, Jesus says to the Pharisees. You cook the books with your little stupid rules, and you avoid the weightier things of your own heart. Stop for a moment and see how corrupt you are, and how inconsistent you are, and how weak you are, and how needy you are before God. Just for a moment. And you'll feel different about people around you. You're forcing your way in, and everybody is. The Romans are forcing their way in, the Essenes are forcing their way in, the Sadducees, and you too, the Pharisees, are forcing your way in. And I don't work that way. And I think Jesus goes on to say, by the way, if that's the equation you want, if you want an equation which really goes back to what you do, you want to develop all these halakha, all these interpretations of the law, and you want to make life about doing the right thing, then you can have it. If you don't want a father that would take his son back, even though he's only semi-repentant, you can have it. You don't want a master who, while he's being ripped off, will still forget about all the debt because relationship matters to him more than the money he lost, then you can have it. You need that kind of master, he says to the Pharisees. You need that kind of father, he says to the Pharisees. Verse 18. We have this bizarre verse. I was reading one commentary, and this guy is sharp. And he got to verse 18, and he said, by the way, I have no idea why this verse is here. I thought that was so great. That's an honest scholar, by the way. But when you understand the progression of what has been going on in this passage, the shift of audience to the Pharisees, when you understand the argument that Jesus is now having from verse 14 on, and you understand this cruddy little equation that the Pharisees have, the verse makes sense. He says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. The verse is not, and hear this clearly, an explanation from Jesus on how he feels about divorce. This is not a sermon from Jesus on his interpretation of, let me explain to you divorce, when it's right, when it's wrong, how it works. It's not that at all. It has nothing to do with that. Don't go to this verse and try to come up with Jesus' theology on divorce. That's not the point of the verse. There's plenty of other verses you can go to. This is not it. This is simply an illustration. All Jesus is saying is, this is what you're like. This is what you're like. You will not be honest about your own heart. terrible to my wife last night. I didn't parent very well this morning. I kind of did some shifty things at work today. I cannot let myself forgive this other person. Just admit it. Just admit what you're like, but you won't do that. And since you won't do that, you turn moralistic. And so what you've done is you've created all these little holocaust. You've created all these little interpretations of the rules so you don't have to do the rules. You're not doing all these little rules to help you do the law. You're doing it so you can avoid the law. And the biggest one you've done, which really irritates me, is divorce. You will take the closest person to you and simply write them a little divorce paper and send them on their way. You will throw your wife away like a bad penny and feel fine about it because you've got a piece of paper and you wrote an interpretation. I think that's crappy, Jesus says. See, he's not explaining his view on divorce. He's targeting the Pharisees. I'm so sorry I picked you guys in the beginning, but just go with it. He is so frustrated that they are so off. His comment to him is, let me just give you one example of what you do. Do you know there's no written halakha on this, but it was oral tradition. They had actually developed a halakha that said this: go ahead and sleep with the prostitute all night long, but in the morning, write her a certificate of divorce. That way you're not still married to her. Yeah, go ahead and run that in the Google for a while. See what doing the right thing does to you? Moralism does not work. Breaking before God and accepting His mercy works every single time. It's interesting, too, it's a participle in this verse. He says, you're continually sending your wives away. You know, the passage doesn't stop this morning. It's amazing. And so the real conclusion that we're going to hit is next week. And I would suggest you bring a box of Kleenex. We're going to go through one of the most amazing, touching stories I've ever read. It's the story of Lazarus and the rich man, the guy who lays outside Lazarus' gate. This is the parable Jesus speaks next after this brutal commentary, after all the other parables he told in one huge section. So, we'll really hit that point next week. But I would be remiss if I didn't share with you a couple of thoughts that were really just stuck in my noodle this last several weeks as I read this passage. And the first thought is this: money, material stuff, is not so much a possession, it's a trust. Material stuff, your stuff, whatever it is a trust. It's not a possession. What do I mean by that? Meaning, the way Jesus views this, it's a two-way relational thing. And this is what Jesus says: I'll give stuff to you and trust you, and then you do the right thing with it and trust me back. It's a very simple equation. I'll give you material stuff, which, by the way, he says, is the smallest thing I can think of to give you, which is just ridiculous, but it is. And I want to see if you can realize it's the stupidest thing in your life and handle it well to invest in other people so that they might see the kingdom. Does that make sense? God entrusts possessions as a way of pointing us beyond the possession to the people that it has the potential to touch. He says you can't serve two masters. And what's amazing, and you know this to your fiber, there's nothing like material stuff to demand a master. Material stuff demands mastery. Either you master it or it masters you. It is not neutral. It is a river. It flows. Either you paddle against the current or it takes you to the bottom. Do you agree with me on that? It doesn't matter. This is what Jesus said. It will master you if you don't master it. And the way you master it is you realize it's not yours anyway. Does that make sense? I'm not saying don't enjoy it. I just gorged myself in Austria for 2 weeks. But I have no qualms about doing it because I freely realize what I have is not mine. And I mean everything. Your car, your house, your cupboards, your refrigerator, your bank account, everything. I got to tell you, folks, and this is going to sound brutal, but I just don't care. we just got to think more clearly. We got to think soberly. I'm not. If you're here this morning and you're figuring Jesus out, this is not for you. If you're here this morning and you've decided I'm going to follow Jesus, but you're really new at it, this is not so much for you. If you've been in the faith for a long time, this is directly for you. I'm amazed when I hear this a lot, unfortunately, about people that have been in Christianity and following God for a long time that don't give consistently of their stuff. And it's not, I'm not mad at them. I'm just blown away at the stupidity of it. We're not going to find life in our material stuff. We will create life through it. It's very different. Oh, that we were a church with 150 people and we all got this. Let this be a thrill. And by the way, as a compliment, you're starting to get this. The first time in the history of this church, since I've been here for like 17 years, there's actually money in the bank in this church. I've never seen it before. And this is not just about giving in this church. This is about who eats at your table. This is about who you bless, with loaning your stuff out to, even your sacred stuff. Right? Does that make sense? It's a trust. If you haven't been faithful with something as unrighteous as your wealth and your possessions, who on earth is going to give you the keys to the mystery of unfolding life? The second comment that really hit me is this, and this is so key. Fighting your own reality, fighting your own sense of how broken you are, will simply lead you to an extremely pressured life and a life of moralism where you judge other people. We really, I've been an elder, I've been a chairman of this church, I'm not either one anymore. It's funny, if I was going to boil down Christianity to you, I would tell you it's two things. And these are really simple. This is Doug's kind of that I needed for dummies, right? So here it is. And every day I think these two things. Do I know that God loves me? Do I know He's for me? And if He is, and oh, by the way, if you don't, that's okay, because every day I have to wrestle with that. If you don't, that little thing in the back kind of says something to you. It says, I died for you when you didn't like me. Can you imagine how I'll treat you now that we're kind of friends? Amen? So here's number one, God, do you like me? Number two, how today can I say thank you to you? That's it. I've grown tired of people asking me, what's the vision of Creekside? I'm so sick of that question. You want a vision? There's your vision. And it's not for anybody else that you're sitting next to. It's for you. Doesn't matter who you are. This is two questions. Do you love me? And if you do, can I say thank you to you in some way? All I'm doing here on Sunday morning is doing two things. I know what I'm called. I'm not called to be a pastor of a church. I'm called to be a priest. That's what God asked me to do years and years ago. And He asked me to be a priest in a certain way. The priests in the Old Testament, the sacrifices were the lesser. The bigger thing they were supposed to do was simply tell the story. Right? And that's all I'm trying to do. I've dug around the rubble of the temple and realized I found the scroll, and hardly any churches that I could find are telling the actual story. They're all giving me 3 ways to be more successful, 7 ways to be more prioritized in my life. I'm just sick of all that junk. All I want to know is what's the story of God. And I feel like I found the scroll, and God said to me, you're a priest, tell the scroll to people. And so there's my gifting. And what's my calling? It's right here. And for right now, He said, Doug, you're going to stand right here. For 15 years, I stood upstairs. Now He wants me to stand here. If tomorrow He asks me to stand somewhere else or stand nowhere, I'm totally okay with it. And I only ask 2 questions. Do you love me? And is there a way I can say that? And it's not just here, by the way. It's when I go to Safeway. And I walk through the aisles. And I say, God, you love me. Why are you blessing me? Well, that person doesn't look like they're doing very well. In Austria, it was just a love fest. Lynn kept saying to me, she sings this song about me. Making friends everywhere he goes. It's just this, because it's so beautiful. When you stay connected with, I deserve none of this. Right? I'm so thankful, God, that you dig me. I don't even dig me half the time. And I feel so good from that, I only ask one question. What way can I say thankful to you? Say thank you to you. And our material staff is just one way to do it. Well, back in Austria. Let's pray. Oh, Father, we're way too complicated. And I'm the head of the class on that. In the words of Leonard Skinner, make me a simple man. Father, emphatically, you love us. You love us. You like us. How can we say that? Not out of compulsion. Not to make you happy with us. Not to make us feel better about ourselves. But just because it's such a small thing you ask in response to the heaping you pour on us.